Today we're going to be talking all about ask and answer questions, which is going to be your first fiction unit that you teach. I have like seven-ish, I think maybe 7 or 8 suggestions for your first unit, which is ask and answer questions. And I suggest ask and answer questions because you can kind of stem all of the other ELA standards off of this standard. So what I first suggest is to start with RL. And I have a pacing guide that kind of outlines how I think you should teach each of the standards. And I have the RL and RI standards in one column. So I suggest teaching either or. So if you're teaching during your reading block, I wouldn't suggest having a nonfiction block and a fiction block. I would suggest picking your standard and then just having either or during that block. And in all grade levels, I do suggest starting with fiction and the fiction version of ask and answer questions. I think that fiction's a little bit easier for students to tackle because they can understand some of the context a little bit better. When you get into informational, you are going to see kids that struggle with the harder context of everything. So I do have pacing guides. Let me grab those for you. They are free. And if you are interested in a free pacing guide, it is my suggestion for how to fit all of the Common Core standards into your year. No, it's not perfect. No, it's not going to match every single district, but it is just my suggestion. You can build off of it, but it is merely a starting block for you to look at, get an idea. You can use it to 100%. You can 100% follow what I suggest, or you can take bits and pieces of it. But in all grade levels that I do have you starting with literature standards and the ask and answer version of literature. So that was my first suggestion. My second suggestion is to simply start with determining the difference between a question and a statement. And that's going to be based more with your kindergarten, first grade students. So once you're second, third, fourth grade, you're not really going to have to focus on this very much. So I won't spend too much time here. But you do have to, at the beginning of their educational life, they do need to learn, what is a question and what is a statement and how do those relate to a book. So when they're reading a passage, they need to know what questions I'm going to hear, what questions I'm going to need to create, and what I need to do within my listening or within my reading to take those questions and put them into action. So one activity that I suggest starting with the younger students is to just simply have them give examples of questions. So make a big anchor chart in your classroom, and in the middle, just say, what is the question? They can either write what a question is, like the definition of a question, or they can give you an example of what a question is. So that will help them to determine when they're having to ask a question, they're going to know exactly what is expected of them instead of kind of trying to retell the story. So when they're asked to ask a question about a text, having that stark difference between questions and statements, that's going to help them in the end. My third suggestion for your ask and answer unit is after you determine the difference between question and statement, and then you're going to kind of grow that into the difference between asking and answering. So you will eventually teach asking questions after you teach answering questions, and I'm going to talk about in the next suggestion. But I do suggest starting with simply, when you're introducing this standard to the students, you do need to teach them the difference between what it means to ask a question and what it means to answer a question in relation to fictional stories. So I would suggest making some sort of an anchor chart or showing some sort of an anchor chart that helps to outline what is expected of the students in both situations. So the thing that's going to be easier is answering questions, because it's a lot easier for the students to comprehend a story and answer a question about the story than to ask a strong question about the story. Because when students are asked to ask a question, sometimes it can be hard for them to think of a strong enough question to ask about that context. And we're going to talk about asking questions in just a couple of slides. But really putting those two differences at the beginning of your unit is very important. And then we'll talk more about when you're asking questions, you're teaching them to ask before, during, and after, and then the difference between thick questions and thin questions. But I do suggest, and it's coming up soon, that you do start with answering questions, because it's going to be a lot easier. But at the bottom of that anchor chart, you see the 5 W's and then the H. But that's going to be important for both asking questions and answering questions. You're going to constantly be reminding the students that they need to be using the who, what, where, when, why, and how. And then as they grow and get a little bit more comfortable with this skill, then they can move into, explain, identify, describe, answer. Well, not answer. I'm trying to think of other words that they're going to be asked to do with their text. So at the very beginning, you're simply teaching just those easy question words. So then I said we were going to focus on answering questions. So you're going to start with your answer questions unit. Answering questions is a lot easier of a skill for students because they can simply listen or comprehend and use those comprehension skills to answer. So they're not using this brand new skill of having to think about a question based on the text and think about a question based on the cover. And this answering, all they're being required to do is comprehend. So I would suggest to stick at the beginning of your unit with easier plots and maybe familiar text, because if they can focus on the skill as opposed to a complex plot, they're going to be able to really take away from some of the confusion for what's going on in the story, and they can focus on the skill, which is the teacher asking them questions and they're having to answer those questions. So one thing I suggest is a lot of mentor text and a lot of modeling. So what I would suggest in the beginning of your unit is to model the act of answering questions. So choose a strong mentor text that can align to this unit, which I have outlined in the suggested read alouds. Those come in each of my ELA units, and I have a link to my blog post that has the suggested mentor text for each standard. Please keep in mind that my blog today and kind of for the whole week has been super slow. So the link should work, but it just might take a couple seconds. I have somebody working on that, trying to figure it out. But my blog's been super slow all week. So that link, it might take you a minute to get there. But the link I just dropped is my suggested mentor text. So once you have your suggested mentor text and you start gathering all those books, what I would suggest doing is modeling how to answer questions by yourself. So as you're reading, maybe you'll have some task cards like the ones you see in the picture, where as you're reading, you're going to stop and ask questions to yourself and answer those questions using the text and finding that text evidence. So once you model the act of using text evidence and finding in the pictures and the words where you're finding your answers, then you can move on to having the students do it with you. So the students at the beginning, I do definitely suggest doing whole group. For the most part, maybe at the beginning, 3 days in a row where they're just listening to a read aloud and answering questions from you. And then maybe at that 4th or 5th day of the unit, they can kind of shift into just partner buddy reading with those questions. And that might be like a slow let go where you're doing it and then they're practicing it with you and then they can do it on their own. And then once you guys kind of master those answering questions, then you can shift into the harder skill of asking. So asking questions is a lot more difficult for students because sometimes they have a hard time determining what a valid question would be versus what maybe a more simple question would be. So at the beginning, it is difficult for kindergarten and first grade to answer like thick and thin questions, or sorry, ask thick and thin questions. So you have to work up and build up so that they can start asking questions about a text that are very complex and detailed. So you are going to remind them about the 5 W's, and you're going to help them, give them those stems. So you'll maybe display the 5 W's on the board and give them an activity. And as they're having to create and ask questions about either their text or their pictures, which I'll show you in just a minute, they can have those stems there all throughout that lesson. So what I suggest is to start with pictures. So asking questions about an image is going to be a lot easier than asking questions about a text. So what I would suggest when you are teaching your ask and answer unit is to start with images and to maybe display one image at a time and have the kids do like a mixed pair share activity or a buddy activity where they have to ask strong questions about the images that they see. So there's 4 pictures. I'm not sure which grade level I pulled these from, but you'll display these and the kids will come up with strong questions about each of these. So, and then some of them can eventually share their responses that they had with their partners. So, for example, you're wanting them to share their strong questions or their thick questions instead of their thin questions. So you're going to be looking for things. For example, if you look at the cactus picture, you're going to want them to eventually get to a question that's stronger, like, why is there no grass in this picture? Or what kind of climate does this picture have? Instead of saying like, what color is the cactus? Or what do I see in the picture? You're going to try to move them into asking deeper questions that can teach them more about that content. So one thing that I do, and I know that what I just showed you was for an RI unit, that was for an informational unit, but you can do the same with fictional stories and cartoons. So you could show pictures of cartoons where you're asking the students to ask a question about what they see in that cartoon. So it might be a little bit more, instead of who do I see in this picture or what is the person doing, they can eventually get to a deeper level of questioning. Why does that student or why does the kid in that picture look sad? How does the student feel? What just happened to make the student feel that way? And then at the beginning, I had easy peasy and strong, and then I changed it to thick and thin. So in the picture that you see here, this is also from the informational unit. We have easy peasy and strong questions, which soon will be thick and thin. They were switched over. But you're teaching the students and you're giving them examples of what a thick question would be and what a thin question would be. So that's going to be, what color is the shark versus how is the shark moving through the water? Things that they'll be able to ask and learn. So I definitely suggest starting with pictures because it's a little easier for the students to wrap their brain around that. And then once they have the opportunity to practice those skills, then they can shift into text and they can start using those asking questions skills when they're listening or when they're reading text. So then I have the suggestion of modeling with strong mentor text, which I suggested in the beginning of this video, and I did put a link in the comments for the mentor text. So I would suggest a daily mentor text throughout your whole unit. So you might have a week-long unit for ask and answer questions, or you might have a 2-week unit, however long you think your students need. And then I would try to pick a daily read aloud that can really align with this standard. And I have, let's see, on the link I posted, I do have 10 suggestions. 2, 4, 6, 8. Yes, I have 10 suggestions. So if you do drag this unit out into a 2-week unit, I do have 10 suggestions that you could have for each day that I think are strong resources that you can use that really help students be able to ask questions about what's going on in the text and what's going on in the images as well. So when you're teaching them how to ask questions, you're wanting them to be able to ask questions before, during, and after a text. When you're asking them to ask questions, they need to be able to do that skill before they're reading, during their reading, and then after their text. So before, they're going to ask questions about maybe the title or the image on the cover. If you do a picture walk, they might be asking questions about what they see in each of the pages. And then during the read aloud, you can stop and ask your students to turn and talk to each other and ask their partner a question about what's happening during the story. And then at the end, of course, you will have them ask questions that they still have about the plot or the events or the characters or the settings. And then, of course, those answering question skills like we talked about are going to be those comprehension skills that they're going to be working on. Suggestion 7 is to really use the color coding with this skill specifically. So one thing that I've learned is that if you ask kids on a passage to use a crayon to highlight blank, they'll be able to find that text evidence, and that text evidence is what's going to be necessary in this standard to be able to answer questions with proof. So it just depends on how in-depth you're asking those questions. So if they're very simple, it's going to be easier for them to find them in the text. But then, as you get into 3rd grade and 4th grade, you might have to split that up and have them underline the text evidence and then ask them a more in-depth explanation based off of what they underline. So one example I have is this is one of the activities from a lesson plan where I think the kids read this with their partner, and then the teacher reads this as a whole group, and then each of the kids get a copy, and they have these little task cards, and they have colored crayons that they have to underline where they found it. And that skill of being able to find that text evidence is going to help with their answering. So when they're you can see in the picture, it says use your red crayon to highlight who studies whales. So they'll have to look in their text for the sentence to underline about who studies whales. And then on the follow-up activity, there's a question that says, what type of scientist studies whales? And they have their answer already from their text evidence activity that will help them answer those questions. And then, so this is a structured activity where you're asking the kids to follow commands. So use your orange crayon to highlight what a whale eats. Use your green crayon to highlight what a whale can breathe. So that's a more structured activity that can teach them the act of text evidence. But eventually, you're going to want your students to be able to do it on their own. So here in the picture, you see that this is just a passage. It's not an activity that's led. It's an independent practice, or it can be a partner practice activity or a partner passage where there's 4 questions based on a text, and the students have practiced this underlining color-coded text evidence so much that they can maybe color code each of their questions and go and underline their answers in the text. So that's going to help go hand in hand with the future skills that they have, and it's going to help them answer their questions. And our final suggestion, and this one's pretty much the easiest one to do, because this one's going to be that you need to revisit the standard with every unit and every read aloud that you do. So this is why I suggest starting your year with ask and answer questions, because this standard can be retaught and revisited and practiced again in every single Common Core standard, because the next standard that you teach might be retelling a story or story elements or unknown words in a text, whichever one you're going to shift onto after this first unit. No matter what you shift onto next, ask and answering questions is going to be done in every single standard. So this one I do suggest starting with, and then always going back and having kids ask questions and answer questions on every single book they read, every single activity that they do with a passage or a book, so that you don't have to have an explicit reteach of the standard. You're going to be practicing and recycling that through with every unit. So those are my 8 suggestions for ask and answer. I wanted to thank you guys for tuning in today, and stay healthy and safe.